Okay, we're back for section 16, continuing on with key EAR definitions. We've seen some good ones already, the control list, the country chart. Now we're going to talk about a really important definition, the export control classification number, or what's referred to as an ECCN. What is it? It's an alphanumeric sequence that identifies controlled items on the CCL. For example, 5A001, we'll be seeing a lot of that moving forward, which happens to apply to telecommunication systems, equipment, components, and accessories. That's a little technical. What do we mean by that? Well, the ECCN is what appears in the Commerce Control List. It's the actual number, the classification, the citation of an ECCN, a particular product that is controlled. And by controlled, we mean that it has a higher threshold of authorization from BIS, an export license application and approval, or maybe, as we'll talk about later, a license exception. But what we're talking about is the actual number, an alphanumeric sequence that identifies a controlled item on the CCL. We saw one briefly a few slides back. We'll continue to see more examples as we move forward. That 5A001 will continue to appear. So each number and letter in our second bullet point has a specific meaning. It's not a random scenario. Each number, each letter means something. Well, the first number denotes the category, 0 through 9. More on that in just a second. The first capital letter signifies a product group. So the 5A, the 5 means something, the A means something. The remaining numbers denote reasons for control, the specific reasons why in a specific entry and a specific citation for control. Let's see what we can do to illustrate this point a little bit further. What we're looking at here is a landing page off of BIS, as the name would indicate, the Commerce Control List. It gives an explanation of the categories and the product groups. But as a quick reference, on the left-hand side, you can click on the Commerce Control List, the Commerce Control Index, which we saw some examples of, the Commerce Country Chart. You can click on a variety of things here. What we're looking at is the landing page, one of the landing pages for the Commerce Control List. We want to demonstrate where these categories come from, the numbers, and where the uppercase letters come from, the product groups. Well, let's have a look. On the Commerce Control List categories, well, you'll see 0, nuclear miscellaneous. Number 1, materials, chemicals, microorganisms, and toxins. 2, materials processing. 3, electronics. 4, computers. 5, hearkening back to our recent example, telecommunications. 5, part 2, information security. 6 is sensors and lasers. 7 is navigation and avionics. 8 is marine. And 9 is aerospace and propulsion. Moving over to the 5 product groups on the right-hand side, A, systems, equipment, and components. B, test, inspection, and production equipment. C, material. D, software. E, technology. So we can already start to see how these numbers come together to give a very clear picture of what an ECCN represents. 5A001, in our example, telecommunications equipment that happens to be a system, equipment, and/or components. So let's continue on with item categories using the ECCN example 5A001. The number 5 is highlighted because that's what we're talking about here. So we just went through the list, but let's run through it again quickly just to be thorough. 0, nuclear materials, facilities, and equipment and miscellaneous. 1, materials, chemicals, microorganisms, and toxins. 2, materials processing. 3, electronics. 4, computers. 5, the one we're interested in, telecommunications and information security. 6, sensors and lasers. 7, navigation and avionics. 8, marine. And 9, aerospace and propulsion. So we are in the telecommunications and information security category. Let's have a look at the product group now. 5A, of course, A being highlighted in red, 5A001. Well, it's equipment, assemblies, and components. Pretty clear indication there. B would have been test, inspection, and production equipment. C, actual materials. D, software. E, technology. So we're looking at 5A001, A being the group of equipment, assemblies, and components. Let's talk about the remaining numbers. The digits, what do they mean? Well, the second and third digits signify the reasons for control. We had a look at these. This is where they manifest themselves in specific ECCN entries. Well, 0 stands for national security. 1 is missile technology. 2, nuclear nonproliferation. 3, chemical and biological weapons. And 5 are items warranting national security or foreign policy controls as determined by the Department of Commerce. We'll see a lot of entries that make reference to national security. Make a mental note of that now. But to reiterate on this slide, we're looking at the second and third digits and what they mean. The list is there. Continuing on with the second and third digits, a 6 would signify those 600 series. You'll recall we talked about that during ITAR as part of the specific Export Control Reform Initiative. 600 series controls for items on the Wassenaar Arrangement Munitions List, or formally on the USML. That's taking us back to that ECR, Export Control Reform Initiative. If there's a 9, it stands for anti-terrorism, crime control, regional stability, short supply, or UN sanctions. That last digit also means something. It sequences the numbering of ECCNs to differentiate between CCL entries. This is a nice example, but important to note, we're going to step away from 5A001 for a minute and look at 3A001. The reason for that is this is an actual example that the EAR provides. You'll note the source in the lower right-hand corner. So we're not trying to confuse matters. We're just trying to give a broader perspective on how these ECCN numbers work. 3A001 is an example that BIS likes to use. And it's a nice visual representation because it breaks it all down in one slide in terms of what these letters and numbers mean. So let's have a look. 3A001 right in the middle. Well, the 3 falls under those categories that we already went through twice. Now, this arrow's a little bizarre, to be honest, because it points at number 2, but it's actually number 3. We'll let the EAR people slide on that one, but it's actually electronics. The arrow should be facing down a little bit further. So we're talking about some sort of electronics product. Well, what kind of product might that be? The groups will help us make that distinction. It's an A. It could have been a B or a C or a D or an E. This is an A. And as we saw previously, A represents equipment, assemblies, and components. If it was a B, would have been test, inspection, and production equipment. C, materials, D, software, E, technology. In our example, it's an A, so we're going to run with that. Next 2 digits happen to be a 00. Talks about reasons for control. 0 happens to be national security reasons and items on the NSG dual use annex and trigger list. That's something that will come up much later on in this section. Had there been a 1 in there, missile technology reasons, a 2, nuclear nonproliferation, 3, chemical and biological weapons reasons, or 9, anti-terrorism, crime control, regional stability, short supply, UN sanctions. So those digits represent the reasons for control. And then that last digit is used for sequential numbering of ECCNs, because there's usually more than one in a given category. Let's have a quick export perspective here to bring further light on this subject. An example of ECCN 6A003 from the Commerce Control List Index and its corresponding Commerce Control List entry. So we're looking at, as we saw previously, the index. We happen to pick a product here, cameras, instrumentation cameras, that falls under 6A003.A. We'll talk more about the extensions beyond 6A003 or 5A001, but this particular citation, as it's called, is 6A003.A. It's that same index that we saw previously, just happens to be in a different area, the letter C. This is the corresponding entry. And again, what we're trying to do here is illustrate the ECCN, because after all, we're in the definitions and talking about ECCNs. So if you go down to our red area here, this is where the citation appears in the actual CCL, the actual Commerce Control List. So if we go from the index, we identify our specific product. If we find it on here, we have to go look up and see what the story is, basically. If you go down to the red circle, that is where the actual ECCN is for this particular type of camera. It talks about cameras, systems, or equipment, and components thereof. So we're on the index, we found our description, we go to the CCL. This is what it looks like. We're still on definitions here, but we do want to continue to provide a broader frame of reference for how the nomenclature works for each ECCN citation because the content will be different, but the way the page is set up, it's the same. So things like reasons for control. Depending on the country that we're exporting to, these are the reasons for control that are in place for this product. That's a tie-in to the actual country chart. We'll get to that later on. Below that, and we won't go into detail here, but more detailed descriptions about what the controls are for particular entries, for particular citations. Looking in the lower right, and we're getting a little far ahead of ourselves here, but do want to, as I said, point out certain important components of an entry. List-based license exceptions. The potential license exceptions that can be applied to this particular ECCN. We have lots and lots of material on license exceptions, but we'll stop here for now on that subject. So we're going to wrap up this particular section and pick back up with other important EAR definitions, starting out with deemed exports. So we'll see you back shortly.